Lumen Danzinger had spent most of her 23 years in the hush of darkness, relying on the familiar weight of her cane to guide her through narrow hallways and unfamiliar sidewalks. She lost her sight as a child when a genetic illness took hold of her optic nerves, and ever since then, she had navigated the world through the softness of voices and the texture of touch. Her parents had done everything in their power to find a cure or at least some relief for her condition, but life had other plans. One by one, they both fell ill and passed away by the time she turned 18, leaving her with only a small inheritance and a quiet house on the edge of a struggling Midwestern town. That inheritance dried up quickly, forcing her to sell the house and move into a cramped, aging apartment with creaky floors and a single drafty window she couldn't even see. She managed her days by the rhythm of routine, waking early to listen to the radio announcer's voice, carefully making breakfast by counting steps from the tiny stove to her worn-out table, then practicing the piano by touch in the afternoons. Occasionally, she would pick up odd jobs from neighbors who needed braille transcription or someone to test specialized reading software for the blind. It paid little, but each modest check felt like a lifeline. Everything changed on a late autumn evening. The air was crisp and carried the faint smell of chimney smoke from nearby houses. Lumen was sitting by her old upright piano, letting her fingertips glide across the chipped keys, playing soft progressions that she could scarcely remember. That was when the phone rang, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the stillness of her apartment. She fumbled for the receiver, her heart lurching at the thought of another collection agency call. Instead, she heard a calm, low voice, articulate and precise. "Good evening," the man said. "Am I speaking with Miss Danzinger? My name is Dr. Preston Hale. I'm an ophthalmic surgeon based in Chicago." She almost dropped the phone. Though she had never met him, she had heard whispers of Dr. Hale's innovations. He was something of a prodigy who had gained a reputation for pushing boundaries in medical research, sometimes stirring controversy in the process. That he would call her directly felt surreal. "Miss Danzinger," he went on, "I've examined the old medical records your late parents compiled, and I believe you may be an ideal candidate for an experimental procedure I've been developing. I've made recent breakthroughs with my team, and if the operation is successful, you could, potentially, regain partial or even full sight." Her first instinct was disbelief. Too many doctors had promised a miracle only to retreat when they realized how risky or complicated her case actually was. Yet Dr. Hale's voice had a ring of confidence. He was neither dismissive nor overly optimistic. Rather, he sounded certain, as if he had weighed every variable ahead of time. Curiosity and a pulse of hope mingled in her chest. She managed to ask the question that always emerged whenever a glimmer of opportunity presented itself. "How much does it cost?" Her parents had spent all they had chasing cures that never materialized, and Lumen herself lived on the brink of eviction. "I'm prepared to handle all expenses," he replied calmly, "including the surgery, rehabilitation, and follow-up care. But the nature of this procedure is sensitive. I have conditions, Miss Danzinger. Not financial ones, but personal." For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. She could feel her grip on the phone tightening, her thoughts racing into confusion. Personal conditions. Did he want her to serve as a research subject for a lifetime, maybe sign away her right to speak about the experiments? That wouldn't be the strangest thing a doctor had proposed. But his next words jolted her more deeply than any suggestion she had imagined. "If my experimental procedure works and you regain your sight," Dr. Hale said, his voice steady but strangely intimate, "I would like you to consider becoming my wife." Lumen felt as if the air had been knocked from her lungs. She didn't even know this man, didn't know what he looked like, didn't know anything beyond rumors of his brilliance and his knack for controversy. Marriage? Was this some cruel joke? She was used to condescending remarks and pity, but never had anyone offered her something that sounded so transactional. So bizarre. Hale's tone softened, as though he sensed her shock. "I realize it must sound unorthodox. But I've found myself in a predicament where I need a wife who understands privacy and is willing to trust me, even without fully comprehending the family obligations I'm under. In return, I can give you the one thing your parents fought so hard for. A chance to see. It would have been easy to hang up the phone, call him a lunatic, and be done with this. Yet Lumen couldn't. A small part of her, maybe the part that longed to behold the shape of a tree's leaves or the color of a morning sky, took hold of her heart and wouldn't let go. She found herself agreeing to meet him in person, to at least discuss the possibilities. She set the phone back on its cradle with trembling hands. The next day, as she sat on her ragged couch, turning her cane over in her palms, Lumen wondered what kind of man would propose such an arrangement. She tried to think of the practicalities. Could she truly trust a stranger's motives? Even if the surgery worked, marriage was not some casual undertaking. She had no illusions about love at first sight, she had never even seen another's face. But might there be a reason behind his proposal that wasn't predatory or manipulative? Might it, in some strange way, be a door to a future she had never dared envision? She barely slept that night, her dreams a swirl of half-imagined images. There were people she had never seen before, voices she recognized but couldn't place, and somewhere in those dreamlike whispers, she thought she heard her late mother's voice urging her forward. By dawn, Lumen had made up her mind. She would travel to Chicago and meet Dr. Preston Hale in his clinic. She'd assess for herself whether he was a savior, a madman, or something in between. She told herself that she wasn't truly risking anything if the deal turned out to be a facade, but deep down, she knew better. If this man was genuine, if his experimental procedure could grant her eyes the ability to perceive light and color once more, she would be placing her entire life into his hands. And even more unsettling was the thought that she might be placing her heart there as well. Early the next morning, Lumen packed a small overnight bag, carefully folding the few garments she owned that were suitable for traveling. She woke before sunrise, her body humming with equal parts anticipation and dread, and made her way outside to catch a ride to the bus station. The world around her was a tapestry of sound, the scrape of distant tires, the rustle of leaves in a nearby yard, the low murmur of early commuters already on the move. Even though she couldn't see the faint glow of dawn, she felt its presence in the gradual warmth against her skin. The bus ride to Chicago took several hours. She sat next to a window, tapping her fingertips softly on the ridged edges of her cane while trying to calm the riot of thoughts in her mind. Each bump in the road, each hiss of hydraulic brakes, reminded her that she was heading toward a decision that could transform her life. She rehearsed the questions she wanted to ask Dr. Hale, about his procedure, about the risks, about what exactly he meant by conditions. Mostly, she wondered if he was sincere or if there was an ulterior motive behind his kind offer and unexpected proposal. In the back of her mind, she could not shake the fear that all of this might be some elaborate trap, though she also clung to the possibility that it could be exactly what he claimed, a once-in-a-lifetime chance to restore her sight. By the time the bus arrived in the city, it was nearing noon. Lumen exited onto a noisy street, where car horns and the echo of footsteps on concrete assaulted her ears. The air smelled of exhaust, roasted nuts from a vendor's cart, and the faint tang of the Chicago River. With cautious movements, she extended her cane and found the curb, then navigated toward the nearest taxi stand. She handed a slip of paper with Dr. Hale's clinic address to a driver who confirmed, "Got it, miss," and ushered her inside a cab. The engine's rumble and the vibration of city traffic beneath her seat were overwhelming, but she steeled herself. If she truly wanted a new future, she had to be brave enough to face the unknown. The clinic itself was situated in a sleek glass and steel building in the heart of Chicago's medical district. When the taxi came to a halt, an attendant wearing soft-soled shoes approached, opened her door, and offered a gentle hand to help her out. Lumen thanked him, leaning on her cane as she stepped onto the polished stone walkway. She sensed the space around her, high ceilings, a gust of air-conditioned wind escaping through wide automatic doors. Inside, the lobby was bustling with medical staff, patients, and visitors all weaving in different directions. The polished floors produced echoes of footsteps that bounced off the walls, making it difficult to get her bearings at first. A receptionist with a bright, courteous tone greeted her and, upon checking the appointment register, led her to a quieter hallway. "Dr. Hale will see you in his private office on the top floor," the receptionist said, pressing the elevator button. "He's been expecting you, Miss Dansinger." The elevator ride seemed interminable, the hum of the machinery resonating in her ears as the numbers ticked upward. Lumen tried not to let her nerves get the best of her, but her grip on the cane grew tighter with each passing second. When the doors slid open, another assistant in crisp attire greeted her politely and guided her through a short corridor until they reached a heavy wooden door. A discreet nameplate read, "Preston Hale, M.D., Ph.D., Director of Ophthalmic Innovations." With a gentle knock, the assistant announced her arrival. When Lumen stepped into the office, she first noticed the scent of something faintly citrus, perhaps a diffuser on a nearby table. The room was hushed, insulated from the outside bustle of the clinic. Dr. Hale rose from behind a large mahogany desk, his footsteps measured as he approached. He took her hand in greeting, and she was aware of a slight warmth in his palms, along with the deft confidence of a surgeon who spent every day performing delicate procedures. "Thank you for coming," Dr. Hale said. His voice was much clearer than it had been over the phone, resonating with the authority of someone used to taking charge. Yet there was a subtle undercurrent of tension there too, as if he was aware of the peculiarity of their situation. "I'm pleased you decided to meet with me in person. Please, have a seat." He guided her to a chair opposite his desk. She heard the faint click as he turned off a computer monitor, perhaps to give her his full attention. The assistant quietly excused herself and closed the door, leaving them in a private, spacious office. Lumen could almost feel the weight of Dr. Hale's gaze, as if he were studying her face for any sign of reaction. She decided to be direct. "I'm still not entirely sure I understand what's going on. You said you've studied my medical records and believe you can help me see. But you also mentioned marriage. Before we talk about anything else, could you please explain why you want such an arrangement?" Dr. Hale drew in a breath, as though organizing his thoughts. "I won't lie, it's an unusual request, and I apologize for the abruptness. My research into gene therapy and advanced corneal implants is at a critical juncture. I have the means to perform the procedure, and I'm confident in the potential for success, especially in your case, given your specific diagnosis. However, my personal life, my family situation, is complicated. My mother, who holds significant influence over the funding and direction of my research, has given me something of an ultimatum. She believes settling down will bolster my position and credibility, both within the medical community and in the public eye. And because of certain family obligations, she insists that I marry soon." Lumen felt a rush of conflicting emotions. It sounded almost archaic. Was he truly being coerced by some old-fashioned sense of familial duty? Or was there something more personal at play? "So, in exchange for giving me this operation, you're proposing that I marry you to satisfy your family's demands," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her attempt to remain composed. "Yes," he admitted softly. "Though I hope you won't think of it purely as a business transaction. I'm aware of how it must seem, and I accept that you may not trust me. Nevertheless, I'm prepared to cover all medical expenses, rehabilitation, and anything else you require to adjust if your sight returns. More than that, I give you my word that the best specialists will assist me, ensuring every possible safeguard. If everything succeeds and you regain your vision, I would ask that you fulfill your part and become my wife. Officially." She shifted in her seat, fingers nervously stroking the carved handle of her cane. "And what if something goes wrong? What if the surgery fails?" A knot of fear began to tighten in her chest. After all, failure was a distinct possibility. She'd lived through enough disappointments to know the world never guaranteed a happy ending. Dr. Hale's voice softened. "If it fails, you will not owe me anything, no marriage, no further obligations. I will, of course, still ensure you're cared for. That's the best I can offer under the circumstances. But understand, I've spent years refining this technique. The success rate, while not officially documented because of the experimental nature, is promising. I wouldn't dare risk your life or well-being otherwise. Silence settled between them for a long moment. Lumen sensed him watching her, perhaps waiting for a sign that she would bolt from the office. Part of her wanted to do exactly that. There was an undeniable strangeness in the very idea of binding herself to a man she barely knew, especially when she could not even see his face. But the promise, the chance, of seeing again tugged at something deep within her. She remembered the day her eyesight had fully vanished, how her father tried to calm her, speaking of new medical advancements on the horizon. She remembered each time her mother saved up spare money to take her to specialists who offered fleeting hope. Was she about to walk away from the one person whose knowledge might grant her the vision she'd lost? She inhaled slowly, trying to gather her courage. I'm not saying yes or no at this very moment, she finally managed. I'd like to learn more about your procedure, speak to the team if possible, and maybe even get a second opinion. I have to protect myself. You do understand that, don't you? Of course, he replied. I'd expect nothing less. If you wish, I can arrange a meeting with one of my colleagues. He's not directly involved in the development but is familiar enough with my methods to provide an unbiased assessment. And Lumen, please know you aren't a pawn in some elaborate game. I genuinely believe in what I can do for you. His tone was steady, almost earnest, and for a fleeting moment, she found herself wanting to believe him. Still, the notion of exchanging vows for the sake of a surgery made her pulse race with a mix of anticipation, trepidation, and something akin to reluctant fascination. Before she could respond, there was a light knock on the door. Dr. Hale stood and opened it to admit an older man who introduced himself as Dr. Marcus Rookwood, a veteran ophthalmologist with a grandfatherly warmth in his voice. He shook Lumen's hand and gently explained that he had reviewed a summary of Dr. Hale's research. While he hadn't performed these exact procedures himself, he expressed cautious optimism about the possibility of success in Lumen's case. He spoke of corneal grafting, advanced synthetic implants, and targeted gene therapy, describing them in terms that were both complex and strangely comforting. His greatest emphasis was on the need for Lumen's informed consent and emotional readiness, which made her feel a spark of relief. At least someone here was advocating for her to think carefully, not simply sign on the dotted line. After Dr. Rookwood left, Dr. Hale escorted Lumen back to the lobby. He was respectful, stopping whenever she needed to orient herself. She felt the brush of his sleeve near her arm, a silent readiness to steady her if she faltered, yet he didn't intrude on her personal space. It was an odd courtesy, mingling with the strangeness of his proposition. Outside, the city's midday clamor washed over her again, the rush of pedestrians, the cacophony of car engines, the swirl of voices carried by the wind. Dr. Hale stood beside her, and she sensed his hesitation. She wondered if he wanted to say something more personal, perhaps clarify the bigger reason behind his family's demands. Instead, he simply handed her a business card. Take some time, he said quietly. If you have more questions or if you decide you want to proceed, call me. I won't pressure you, Lumen. Whatever your choice, it must be yours alone. She clutched the card between her fingertips, the smooth surface cool against her skin. With a nod she hoped conveyed both appreciation and lingering wariness, she stepped toward the waiting taxi arranged for her return to the bus station. As she settled in the back seat, she felt an odd flutter in her stomach, a strange mixture of attraction, gratitude, and alarm that left her struggling to catch her breath. Even as the car pulled away and she melded back into the currents of city traffic, Lumen couldn't stop replaying Dr. Hale's words. He claimed he wanted to help her see that all costs would be covered, no strings attached, except for the one monumental string of marriage if the procedure succeeded. Was he desperate, or was there something else that drove him to extend such a bold, life-altering proposition? By the time she was on the bus heading home, she realized she hadn't actually said no to any of it. She had merely asked for more information, for time to think. And that alone was enough to send her heart pounding. She pressed her forehead to the cool window, listening to the hum of the engine, uncertain whether she was on the brink of a medical miracle or stepping blindly into a danger she couldn't yet fathom. In the hours that followed, her mind looped back again and again to the notion of seeing the world for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Was it worth stepping into such an unconventional arrangement? She had lived her life with caution, rarely taking a risk unless forced by circumstance. Now, a leap of faith could reshape her entire future. And oddly enough, a part of her, the part that had grown tired of darkness, was almost ready to take that leap, despite how strange, fraught, or even reckless it might be. By the time the bus rolled into her hometown station, dusk had settled. She disembarked into the cool evening air, cane tapping carefully across the uneven pavement. Back in her small apartment, she set down her bag and let her fingers trace the business card Dr. Hale had given her. No matter how long she thought, the question remained the same: was she truly willing to marry a stranger to see again? Yet she didn't toss the card away, nor did she push it to the corner of some drawer. Instead, she placed it gently on the small bedside table, right beside her alarm clock, where she would be sure to encounter it first thing in the morning. Something told her she hadn't heard the last of Dr. Preston Hale. And the most startling realization was that, beneath her doubts, a flicker of hope was beginning to burn brighter than the darkness she'd accepted for so long. The next few days passed in a blur of indecision and self-reflection for Lumen. She felt as though she'd been thrust onto a tightrope suspended between 2 vastly different realities. On one side lay the life she already knew, the comfortable but confining world of dark hallways and routines she could manage without sight. On the other side beckoned the shimmering possibility of color, shape, and depth, coupled with a marriage she had never imagined. Each morning she woke up hoping for a moment of clarity, only to spend hours pacing her apartment, running her fingertips along the faded wallpaper, counting the steps from the tiny kitchen to the front door, trying to see if she could justify saying yes to Dr. Preston Hale's proposition. Despite her initial hesitancy, she recognized that she needed more information. True to his word, Dr. Hale had offered to connect her with colleagues who could discuss the science behind his experimental procedure. Lumen decided to take him up on that. She braced herself and dialed the number on the business card he had given her, half expecting his office staff to brush her off. Instead, to her surprise, Dr. Hale himself answered. His voice sounded both calm and genuinely pleased to hear from her. He arranged for her to speak again with Dr. Marcus Rookwood, the older ophthalmologist who had introduced himself briefly during her first visit to the clinic. A day later, she found herself on the phone with Dr. Rookwood, a man of unhurried speech and gentle humor. He explained the details behind corneal implants, emphasizing how Hale's new approach blended bioengineered tissue with advanced gene therapy. The complexity of it all made Lumen's head spin, but Dr. Rookwood was patient, carefully repeating key points and making sure she understood the risks. The procedure wasn't guaranteed, no experimental surgery ever was, but he quietly reassured her that if anyone could pull it off successfully, it was Dr. Hale. He had known Hale since his residency and attested to his obsession with finding innovative solutions for patients once considered beyond help. When the call ended, Lumen realized she was sweating despite the cool breeze drifting through her apartment window. Her emotions were tangled. Dr. Rookwood's explanation sounded credible, even hopeful, and yet she could not banish her uneasy awareness that all of this came with a price: marriage to a man she still barely knew. She could not deny the undeniable. Preston Hale's confidence and dedication were compelling, but so was the mystery surrounding his private life. What kind of family pressure would push a brilliant surgeon to barter a life-saving procedure in exchange for a wedding vow? Searching for clarity, Lumen contacted a longtime acquaintance named Harriet, a neighbor from her old home in the small Midwestern town where she had grown up. They weren't exactly best friends, but Harriet had always been kind enough to check in on her, and she was one of the few people Lumen felt comfortable confiding in. They agreed to meet for coffee at a quiet cafe near Harriet's workplace. Although Lumen couldn't see the painted chalkboard menu or the art on the walls, she relished the comforting hum of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Harriet guided her to a corner booth, where they sat opposite each other. At first, Lumen stumbled through the story, unsure how to explain that she was contemplating a deal that sounded too outlandish to be real. Harriet listened with wide-eyed fascination, occasionally interrupting to ask pointed questions. "Are you sure you trust this man? And, what if this goes wrong, Lumen? You've had enough disappointments." Yet Harriet also marveled at the notion that medical science might restore her friend's vision. The dual nature of the proposal, equal parts wonder and alarm, made Harriet shake her head in disbelief. Still, she offered Lumen the best advice she could: think hard about whether you can emotionally handle such an arrangement. If you're going to do it with your eyes open, metaphorically, I mean. After that conversation, Lumen spent the next 2 nights wrestling with her thoughts. She tossed and turned in bed, imagining what it would be like to wake up and see soft sunlight filtering through the curtains, to glance at her own reflection in a mirror she'd never truly looked into. She wondered what Dr. Hale's face looked like. Was he kind-eyed, sharp-featured, or something else entirely? A small part of her burned with curiosity that was almost childlike in its intensity, a curiosity she never realized she possessed. But each time she let herself hope, a nagging voice in the back of her mind reminded her of the risks. What if the procedure worked, and then she was forever tied to a man who had only married her under familial duress? Late on the 3rd evening after her call with Dr. Rookwood, she found herself sitting in the dark in her modest living room, her fingertips resting on the piano keys. She hadn't played more than a few stray notes since that fateful phone call from Hale. Now she let her fingers roam over the keys, producing a hesitant melody that drifted through the still air. The music soothed her nerves just enough for a realization to break through her fear. Every step forward in her life, from learning to cook without sight to finding small freelance jobs to support herself, had required a leap of faith. Perhaps this was just another leap, albeit a far more perilous and profound one. At midnight, unable to tamp down her resolve any longer, she called Dr. Hale once more. His voice, though clearly groggy from being woken at a late hour, was gentle. He didn't sound annoyed at all. If anything, he seemed relieved that she was reaching out again. She told him she still had reservations, that she found the idea of marrying someone under such a contractual framework deeply unsettling. She also confessed that the possibility of regaining her sight was too momentous to ignore. Hale listened in silence until she finished, then spoke softly. "I can only promise you transparency. I'll show you my lab, my research, my life, everything you need to feel secure. And if, after seeing it all, you decide this is not for you, I'll respect your decision. I don't want to corner you, Lumen. I want to help you. But I also won't pretend I don't have my own reasons for needing a wife. My world, my family's world, can be ruthless, and if I can't demonstrate some form of stability in my personal life, I risk losing the chance to help patients like you." She heard the sincerity in his words and found herself moved despite the strangeness of it all. With a trembling breath, she agreed to meet him once again, this time for a more extensive tour of his research facility and a glimpse into his personal life. She ended the call feeling as though she had just signed up for an adventure that would be impossible to walk away from unchanged. That night, as Lumen finally settled into a restless sleep, she dreamed not of darkness but of flickering light, shapes emerging from shadows, and the echo of a piano melody guiding her forward. Somewhere in that half-lit dreamscape, she sensed a presence, neither threatening nor reassuring, simply there beside her. Whether it was Dr. Hale or her own anticipation personified, she couldn't say. Yet when she awoke, her heart pounded with the conviction that she had taken the first real step toward a future she had never believed could be hers. Early on a crisp morning, Lumen found herself sitting in the back seat of a car once again, the rumble of the engine beneath her and the quiet resolve of her decision in the air. Dr. Hale had sent his personal driver to pick her up from the bus station as promised. When he'd offered, she hesitated. She preferred her independence and wasn't yet comfortable with special treatment. But he had insisted, pointing out that his research facility lay beyond the usual public transit lines, and time was of the essence if she truly wanted a comprehensive tour. The car glided through Chicago's bustling streets, and although Lumen could not see the skyscrapers towering overhead, she felt the city's unique energy, clashing horns, snippets of conversation, and the underlying pulse of people perpetually on the move. She pressed her fingertips to the window, feeling the mild vibration of the glass, and tried to picture the passers-by. Were they hurrying to offices, to shops, or maybe to their own life-changing appointments? In that moment, she realized how profoundly her own life might soon change. As the ride wore on, the urban sounds gradually gave way to a quieter atmosphere. The car rolled along a winding road flanked by old trees whose branches swayed gently in the breeze. Lumen sensed they must be leaving the dense city behind for a more secluded area. Eventually, the driver announced they had arrived. The scent of freshly trimmed grass and the cool hush of a manicured courtyard drifted in as the door opened. With a quiet word of thanks, she exited, unfolding her cane as her shoes clicked on polished stone pavers. Dr. Hale stood waiting at the entrance. His posture was as poised as ever, yet the timbre of his greeting was warm enough to ease her nerves. He guided her inside a state-of-the-art building with smooth floors and tall glass walls. The echo of footsteps suggested a spacious atrium. Several people in white coats and business attire bustled by, offering polite nods to Dr. Hale, and Lumen could feel their curious gazes flicker toward her. She wondered if they all knew about the unusual arrangement he was proposing. He led her into an elevator, and they ascended to one of the higher floors. The doors slid open onto a silent corridor where the lighting, if she had been able to see it, probably glowed in a crisp, clinical white. A short walk brought them to a secure lab, where Dr. Hale pressed his ID card against a scanner before opening the door for her. Inside, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. Lumen picked up on the faint, sterile smell of disinfectant mingled with an undertone of sophisticated machinery. Computers hummed softly, and she heard the whir of advanced medical equipment powering up. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, guiding her around. She imagined row upon row of specialized instruments, perhaps sealed glass compartments holding samples, and exam chairs with overhead lights. That was how she pictured hospitals in her mind. "This is the nerve center of my research," he explained. His voice carried pride, but also a note of vulnerable excitement. "I want you to get a sense of the environment where your surgery would take place, of course, if you decide to go through with it." She nodded, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. It was real. Tangible. And yet, the memory of his proposition hovered in her mind. "I appreciate you showing me all this," she said quietly. "I admit, I never imagined I'd be in a lab like this, especially not under these circumstances." He guided her to one of the examination tables and helped her sit. Gently, he took her cane and set it aside with practiced care. Then she felt him lightly tilt her chin upward. Even though she couldn't see him, she sensed his closeness, the warmth of his presence only inches away. "I'll run a quick, non-invasive test," he said softly. "Just to confirm your current baseline, your ocular pressure, nerve responsiveness, that sort of thing. No needles today, I promise." His tone held a gentle humor that brought a faint smile to her lips. She'd endured countless tests in her life, flashes of bright light she couldn't see, puffs of air against her unseeing eyes, but Dr. Hale's approach was methodical and unhurried. He explained each step, the gentle puff of air she might feel, the specialized scanner passing near her face, a few silent moments while a machine recorded data. All the while, she could hear the subtle tension in his voice. Was he worried about the results? Or was there something else entirely weighing on him? When the test concluded, he tapped a few keys on a nearby console. "Everything aligns with what I'd expect given your medical history," he said, his words calm but clearly deliberate. "No surprises so far. That's good news, it means we can proceed with the next phases if you choose to." She tried to steady the flutter of her pulse. "If," she echoed. His hand brushed her arm, cautious but comforting. Yes. I won't force you into anything. Even though our agreement would benefit me in many ways, it's still your life we're talking about. Your eyes. I won't ever lie about that. Before she could respond, someone else cleared their throat at the door, a middle-aged woman with a poised, businesslike tone. Dr. Hale, the new imaging software just finished compiling the data sets you requested. Shall I project them in the main conference room? He turned slightly toward the sound. Yes, drive west. Could you also arrange for a demonstration for Miss Dansinger? She should see. He paused, remembering she could not actually see. I mean, she should hear the details of what we're working with, and how your analysis ties into the procedure. Drive West introduced herself to Lumen in a warm but efficient manner. Together, they moved down the corridor into a conference space that felt more open, with a faint echo that suggested tall ceilings. Lumen heard a large screen activate with a soft beep, presumably displaying the medical images of her eyes. Drive West began explaining the layers of the cornea, how Dr. Hale's approach would integrate a bioengineered segment to replace the damaged tissue, and what gene therapy would be used to stimulate healthy nerve growth. It was an overwhelming flood of scientific language, but Lumen hung on each word, absorbing the seriousness of it. With every phrase about potential complications, her stomach tensed. Yet with every mention of promising preliminary results, hope surged in her chest. She asked questions, some naive, some pointed, and Drive West answered patiently, often deferring to Dr. Hale for more technical specifics. At length, the demonstration ended, and Drive West excused herself, leaving Lumen alone with Dr. Hale in the conference room. He let out a slow exhale, which sounded to her like someone finally escaping a great weight. Thank you for actually hearing us out, he murmured, turning off the projection equipment with a few clicks. The room settled into a hush, lit only by the ambient hum of the building's ventilation. I know it's a lot to take in. She traced her hand along the edge of the table in front of her. It is. But if there's a chance, no matter how slim, to see again, she paused, swallowing hard. I can't just ignore that. Not after all these years. Gently, he guided her upright, returning her cane. There's one more place I'd like to show you, he said. It's not part of the official tour, but it's important you understand the context of my family's expectations. Lumen felt her heart skip. His family. The source of the ultimatum. The reason for this marriage for surgery proposition. She steeled herself as they descended by elevator to a lower level, then walked out a side entrance. A sleek car was waiting, a different driver this time. Lumen slipped inside with Dr. Hale by her side. They drove for about 20 minutes in near silence, the city giving way to rows of upscale homes and finally a gated property. Lumen heard the buzz of an intercom and a gate sliding open. Once inside, the car slowed along a gravel path. She noticed the crunch of tires underfoot, the hush of manicured hedges, and the vastness of a space that felt almost like an estate. When the car stopped, Dr. Hale helped her out onto a paved walkway lined, she guessed, by well-tended foliage. The scent of roses or some similar flower drifted on the breeze. Then the front door of a grand home opened, releasing footsteps that echoed decisively. A woman's voice, clipped and confident, addressed them. Preston, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow. And you've brought a guest. The faint tension in Dr. Hale's stance told Lumen volumes. This was likely the formidable family presence he'd alluded to. He offered a polite greeting, formal enough to confirm her suspicions that this was someone of authority, probably his mother. Yes, mother, he said carefully, this is Lumen Dansinger. The patient I've been telling you about. For a moment, silence filled the space, and Lumen sensed the woman's evaluating gaze, as if she were being measured from head to toe. Finally, she spoke in a civil but cool tone. A pleasure, Miss Dansinger. I trust Preston has informed you of our conditions. Lumen mustered a polite nod. I'm aware of the arrangement. And I'm still considering it. A taut pause suggested the woman was not entirely pleased with that measured reply. Dr. Hale gently guided Lumen inside. The foyer felt massive. She heard the faint echo of her cane's tip on the marble floor, smelled polished wood and expensive cologne mingling in the air. A few more steps, and she felt the temperature shift from the open entry to a more enclosed sitting room. His mother motioned for them to sit. Lumen perched on the edge of a richly upholstered sofa she couldn't see, aware that the woman's scrutiny continued. Dr. Hale cleared his throat. I wanted her to see that I'm not acting on some idle whim. Our family's reputation hinges on stability and tradition, especially with the new expansions to our medical enterprises, and stability, his mother interrupted, a note of impatience creeping into her voice. You're proposing to marry a woman you barely know in order to maintain a veneer of respectability. Hardly stable. But if that's what it takes for you to focus and salvage what's left of our corporate alliances, so be it. Lumen's cheeks warmed. She knew the proposed marriage was a transactional arrangement, but hearing it framed so coldly felt like a punch to the gut. She listened as his mother continued, emphasizing the expectation that the wedding would be discreet, swiftly organized, and beneficial to the family's public image. At one point, she even mentioned how the charitable act of restoring Lumen's sight could be a boon for business, as though Lumen were a prop in a well-orchestrated publicity strategy. Dr. Hale's voice turned strained. Mother, that's enough. I brought her here so she could get a sense of the environment I'm navigating. She deserves to know the full truth. Indeed, his mother replied, unperturbed. I'll give you two a moment. She pivoted and left, her footsteps fading in the cavernous hallway. In the sudden silence, Lumen pressed her lips together, uncertain how to react. She felt both a renewed sense of defiance and a stab of vulnerability. Dr. Hale exhaled heavily. I'm sorry you had to hear it put so bluntly. My family, my mother in particular, has certain standards. It's partly why I've pushed my research so aggressively. I hoped if I achieved enough, she might ease her demands. But that hasn't happened. Lumen swallowed, absorbing the tension that crackled in the air. I appreciate your honesty. It's better to see the situation clearly, or at least, understand it. If you're serious about helping me regain my sight, I need to be serious about the world I'd be stepping into. He hesitated, then reached for her hand, his grip tentative yet reassuring. I want you to be comfortable. I know how strange all this is. In truth, it's not how I envisioned my life. But if we can make something worthwhile out of this arrangement, if I can give you the greatest gift I know how to give, maybe we can both emerge better than we started. I won't pretend it's a simple deal, though. Her heart beat hard in her chest, caught between exhilaration and anxiety. This was the most personal admission she'd heard from him, that he, too, felt trapped by the family empire and was seeking some kind of salvation through their marriage. She wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse, but it humanized him beyond the confident surgeon who promised medical miracles. Before she could respond, a muffled ring sounded, Dr. Hale's phone. He let go of her hand and stepped away to answer, his tone reverting to the controlled professional she had first met in his clinic. Meanwhile, Lumen sat alone in the stately room, the hush broken only by the distant hum of air vents. She lightly touched the arm of the sofa, imagining the ornate patterns she couldn't see, and considered the magnitude of the choice before her. The surgery could change her life in ways she had always yearned for. But it also tethered her to a family whose matriarch viewed her as an asset to be leveraged. And then there was Dr. Hale himself, a man she found simultaneously intriguing and unsettling. As he wrapped up the call and came back, concern etched in his voice, she realized no one could make this decision for her. However sophisticated the lab, however urgent the family's demands, the final step had to be hers alone. She inhaled slowly, her mind teetering between logic and longing. I need some time. A few days, maybe, she whispered, her voice sounding small in the vastness of that room. He nodded, though she couldn't see it, she sensed his solemn acceptance. "Take the time you need. I'll have my driver take you home whenever you're ready." She stood, and he guided her back through the echoing foyer, past the silent watchers, whether servants or family members, she couldn't tell, and finally into the car. As the engine started and the gate rolled open behind them, Lumen felt like she was leaving a fortress of secrets and stepping back into a world she barely recognized. The driver asked no questions, and Dr. Hale rode with her in respectful silence until they reached the city's outskirts, where she'd catch her bus. When the time came to part ways, he squeezed her hand, and she detected an unspoken hope in the way his fingers lingered over hers. She waited in the bus station, hearing the distant roar of departing vehicles, the shuffle of weary travelers, and the overhead announcements for distant destinations. Within her, a tempest raged. Could she ever truly be at peace with a decision like this? Or was this precisely the chance for rebirth she had spent years praying for? Her bus arrived, and she boarded. Sitting near a window as it pulled away, she recalled the crisp, efficient atmosphere of Dr. Hale's lab, where salvation for her eyes seemed close at hand, and the imposing grandeur of his family's mansion, where life was governed by high expectations and cold bargains. The tension of both worlds weighed heavily on her chest. She knew she was standing on the cusp of the most consequential choice she might ever make, to enter a life of uncertain marriage for the sake of a miracle, or to remain safely in darkness. Even as the bus rumbled along the highway back to her modest apartment, Lumen couldn't decide which path frightened her more. Yet a small, insistent voice within her repeated a single, tantalizing truth: if she dared to trust Dr. Hale, she might finally see the sunrise. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would discover that in this strange gamble of hearts and science, real love could spark in the unlikeliest of places. Lumen spent the next few days in a state of unsettling limbo, wandering through her small apartment as though every wall, every piece of furniture, had become unfamiliar. The memory of Dr. Hale's laboratory haunted her in moments of quiet, when she could almost hear the soft whir of medical machines and the calm, measured pace of his voice explaining the wonders of bioengineered tissue. Just as vivid was the recollection of standing in that ornate mansion, enduring his mother's cool appraisal and sense of entitlement. Each recollection felt like a step on a seesaw, tipping her back and forth between intrigue and alarm. She didn't go out much, except for her daily errands, a quick trip to the grocery store on the corner, a stop by the local pharmacy for basic supplies. Her cane tapped against the sidewalks she knew so well, though she traveled them with her mind elsewhere, replaying every word Dr. Hale had said. On some level, it angered her that he was effectively forcing her to choose between the desperate hope of sight and the uneasy confines of a marriage steeped in obligation. But another side of her understood: he, too, was under considerable pressure, a prisoner of his own family's demands. She couldn't quite paint him as a simple villain. One afternoon, Harriet stopped by unannounced, her voice filling the tiny living room with a burst of practical energy. Sensing her friend's disquiet even before Lumen explained anything new, Harriet promptly set down a paper bag of fresh muffins on the wobbly table and demanded an update. Lumen tried to recount everything: the sterile brilliance of Hale's lab, the thoughtful hush when he tested her eyes, and the tense encounter at his family estate. Harriet listened, her silence growing heavier with each word. "So you're telling me," Harriet said at last, "that his mother basically treated you like a deal point in a business contract?" "That's the impression I'm getting." Lumen nodded, even though Harriet couldn't see the gesture. It was more than a little cold, she admitted, her hand drifting over the table in search of the muffin bag. She found it and let her fingertips rest against the paper, wishing she could diffuse the tension with some simple, comforting action like offering Harriet a snack. "But then again, Dr. Hale did warn me about that. He's not proud of it either." Harriet hesitated. Lumen could almost feel her friend wrestling with the urge to protect her while also not wanting to snuff out the faint spark of hope she knew Lumen carried. After a while, Harriet sighed, her warm hand closing over Lumen's forearm. "I just want you to be safe. This is your life. If something goes wrong, if you get hurt." Lumen's throat tightened. She recalled all the times she had tried to imagine color, or the shape of a face, and the heartbreak of realizing she might never experience those things. "I know there's a risk," she said quietly. "But do you know what it's like to spend years wishing you could see, only to be told no doctor could help? And now, here he is, telling me there's a chance." Harriet made a soft sound of understanding. "All right," she said gently. "Then promise me you'll keep your guard up. If you decide to say yes, go in with your eyes, well, I guess ironically, open. Know what I mean?" A wry half-smile curled on Lumen's lips. "I do. And thank you." After Harriet left, the apartment felt more silent than ever. It was as though the walls themselves held their breath, waiting for her choice. Lumen tried to pass the time by revisiting her piano, letting her hands rove across the keys in search of a familiar melody. She found bits of old songs, half-forgotten lullabies her mother used to hum. Yet the notes faltered, and she'd stop in frustration, wishing she could read sheet music by sight, not braille, so she could lose herself in the composition. It was a small, telling reminder of how much easier certain everyday pleasures might be if the surgery succeeded. Days slipped by. Dr. Hale did not pressure her with phone calls or unexpected visits, as he promised he wouldn't. Still, she felt his presence in the back of her mind. It was during a quiet moment, late at night, while lying awake and counting the faint drips of a leaky faucet, that she made her decision. She thought of all the what-ifs. What if it failed? What if she ended up entangled in a marriage that left her feeling alone and used? What if Dr. Hale's mother never accepted her? Yet none of those fears loomed quite as large as the single burning question, what if it worked? She rose before sunrise the next morning, heart pounding. Guiding herself to the kitchen, she made strong coffee by touch, waiting for the sound of the dripping liquid to fill the pot. Once she had a steaming mug in hand, she settled at her tiny table and fished out her phone. She found Dr. Hale's number in her call history. At that moment, it felt like a talisman of fate, and dialed, half expecting he might not answer so early. But he picked up on the second ring, his voice husky with sleep yet immediately attentive. She spoke quickly, before nerves could halt her words. "I've made up my mind," she said, taking a shaky breath. "I want to go through with the surgery." A stunned silence answered her. Then Dr. Hale exhaled, sounding as though he'd been holding his breath all week. "Thank you for calling," he managed. Well, I'm relieved to hear you say that. I know it wasn't easy for you to decide." "It wasn't," she agreed, her throat tight. "But if there's a genuine chance, I can't let it slip away." She paused, bracing herself. "You know that means I'm also agreeing to the terms, about marriage." He responded softly, his tone laced with the careful gratitude of a man who knew better than to gloat. "Yes. And I promise to do everything in my power to make sure you don't regret it." That afternoon, she made the trip to Chicago one last time as her old self, a woman who had only known the world through touch and sound since she was a young girl. Dr. Hale arranged for her to stay in a nearby hotel so she could complete a series of final exams and consultations in the days leading up to the surgery. He greeted her in the lobby, the gentle press of his hand at her elbow guiding her to the reception desk. She checked in under his name, which made her stomach knot with the realization that she was already stepping into his life in ways that felt both comforting and terrifying. The next week was a whirlwind. Each day, she arrived at the lab for preoperative tests. Drive West scanned her eyes with high-resolution imaging devices and took endless measurements to tailor the bioengineered implants precisely to her physiology. On the second day, they introduced her to the physical therapy team that would assist if complications arose. On the third day, a genetic specialist drew blood samples, carefully analyzing her DNA profile for compatibility with the gene therapy element of the procedure. Through it all, Dr. Hale hovered nearby, explaining each step with a mixture of clinical precision and personal concern. She asked him about the anesthesia, about the potential side effects, about what to expect when she woke up. He was honest about the uncertainty, never giving her false guarantees. But his faith in the underlying science was absolute, and his confidence bolstered her own fragile hopes. In the evenings, she would return to the hotel, exhausted and fraught with nerves. Oddly, Dr. Hale sometimes appeared at her door, offering take-out meals and a companionable silence. She wasn't sure how to handle his presence outside the clinical setting. It felt oddly intimate, as if they were edging closer to the reality of becoming husband and wife. More than once, he apologized for the circumstances that had forced them together so abruptly. Each time, she tried to be gracious, reminding him, and herself, that she had made the choice freely. She sometimes wondered if he was waiting for her to ask more about his family or about his personal life, but she found she didn't have the energy for it. Simply preparing for the surgery, balancing her excitement with 1,000 fears, was enough to occupy her every waking thought. Finally, the eve of the operation arrived. She stood at the hotel room window, the thick curtains drawn. She couldn't see the city lights outside, but she felt the hum of traffic drifting up from the streets below. In less than 24 hours, she would be on Dr. Hale's operating table. If all went well, the next time she opened her eyes could be the first time she saw the world in nearly 2 decades. She thought of Harriet's warning, her own doubts, Dr. Hale's anxious determination. Every emotion converged in her chest, leaving her breathless and awake long into the night. She rose before dawn, showered, and dressed in the loose-fitting outfit recommended by the surgical team. Her fingers trembled as she folded her cane and placed it in her bag, not knowing if she would still need it in the same way after everything was done. The driver arrived punctually, and she slipped into the back seat, head resting on the cushion as the car rolled through quiet streets toward the clinic. This time, Dr. Hale waited not at the door but in the pre-op area, wearing surgical scrubs. She recognized his voice instantly, though it was subdued by an edge of tension. He walked her through the final consent forms. His mother had prepared some legal paperwork too, apparently to secure the family's interests, but Lumen barely registered the details. She signed her name on a flurry of documents, focusing instead on her breathing, the beeping of nearby machines, and the sterile smell of disinfectant that pervaded the corridors. At last, they led her to a specialized operating suite. Its hush felt almost sacred, broken only by the rustle of gowns and the soft murmur of the staff. A nurse helped her onto the table, adjusted her head on a supportive cushion, and attached monitoring leads to her temples. Dr. Hale moved around her, speaking quietly with the anesthesiologist. Then his voice came closer, closer until she could feel his breath near her ear. "You're doing great," he whispered, his gloved hand resting on hers. "I'll be right here. Just trust me." She gave a small nod, not trusting her own voice to remain steady. Inside her chest, her heart hammered so loudly she wondered if the entire room could hear it. Then a mask was placed gently over her nose and mouth, and a calm, soothing tone reached her ears. "Deep breaths, Miss Dansinger. Count backward from 10. Darkness swallowed her senses as she inhaled the anesthetic, sinking into a hazy surrender. It struck her with dizzying force that if Dr. Hale's procedure succeeded, this would be the last time she experienced the world exclusively through sound and touch. The enormity of that possibility stole her final conscious thought, that maybe, somewhere on the other side of this, lay not just sight but a future worth seeing. When Lumen awoke, there was an odd, floating sensation that made her feel as if she were drifting between waking and dreaming. Her eyelids felt heavy, as though weighed down by warm sand, and every part of her body seemed wrapped in a soft haze of medication. For a few blurry moments, she could only register the sterile scent of antiseptic and the faint beeping of machines nearby. She inhaled slowly, trying to piece together where she was and why her senses felt so muted. Memory returned in fragments. She had been on an operating table, Dr. Hale's calm voice reminding her to trust him, a mask pressed gently over her nose and mouth, the swirl of anesthesia rushing through her bloodstream. Now she was lying in a recovery room. Her eyelids were bandaged, and although she still couldn't see anything, the darkness was different from the familiar blindness she had lived with for years. A tightness around her temples and a dull, throbbing ache behind her eyes told her that the surgery had happened. Something was different in a way she couldn't yet articulate. A soft footstep approached. Someone was moving carefully across the room. She heard a gentle rustle of fabric as a chair was pulled close to her bed. Dr. Hale's voice emerged, low and reassuring, "You're coming out of it nicely. No sudden spikes in blood pressure, and your oxygen levels are stable." He placed a cool hand on her wrist, feeling for her pulse, and the contact sent a weak spark of relief through her. She remembered that she was no longer merely a patient. After all, there was also the matter of their impending marriage. She tried to speak, but her throat felt scratchy and dry, so all that emerged was a faint croak. He let go of her wrist and reached for a cup of ice chips on a nearby tray. Slipping one between her lips, he murmured, "Take it easy. You've been under for hours. Once you're stronger, we'll get you some water and real food." His tone was hushed, almost tender, and she wondered if it was solely his bedside manner or something more personal. She couldn't see the expression on his face to confirm. After a time, he took another reading of her vitals, then gently brushed his fingertips across the bandages. "The procedure itself went as well as I could have hoped," he continued. "Drive West assisted, and a specialized team was on standby, but everything was smooth. It'll be a few days before we know how fully your eyes will respond. We have to keep the bandages on to let the implant settle." She managed to whisper, "Will I be able to see anything at all when you remove them?" The question came out shaky, born of a fragile hope that had lived inside her since she was a child. "I believe so," he said, confidence tempered by caution. "But we'll proceed in stages. Sometimes the brain needs time to adjust when sight is restored after so many years. I don't want you to be alarmed if things look hazy at first. We'll monitor you closely, Lumen." She squeezed his hand, which she realized she was still holding. "Thank you," she rasped. There was so much more she wanted to say, about how surreal it felt to rely on his promises, to trust that he'd truly changed her life. But the swirl of pain medications and lingering effects of anesthesia made it impossible to articulate everything. As the day wore on, nurses came and went with hushed voices, checking her for fluids and administering medication to manage pain. She dozed intermittently, her dreams laced with flashes of color, vague hints of swirling reds and greens that made her question whether she was truly dreaming or experiencing brief bursts of visual activity. Each time she woke, she tried to piece together the differences in this darkness surrounding her. It was no longer the familiar blank slate but something else entirely, a canvas waiting for light. Eventually, Dr. Hale left to attend to other patients, and another voice drifted into the room, his mother's. Lumen recognized the clipped syllables, the refined confidence that seemed to hover on the edge of disapproval. "I just want to see for myself," she heard the older woman say, her tone subdued yet unmistakably brisk. Footsteps drew closer to the bed, and Lumen felt a prickle of tension course through her. His mother said nothing for several moments. Lumen could imagine the woman's cool gaze scrutinizing the bandages and the lines of her body, evaluating whether this procedure was worth the family's trouble. Then the voice came again, quieter than before, "You've made quite a choice, haven't you, young lady? I do hope you realize how much rests on this little arrangement." Lumen swallowed, still feeling a stab of dryness in her throat. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation, especially now when she felt so vulnerable. "I know there's a lot at stake," she managed to say, the words rasping slightly. She was careful to keep her tone respectful, even though she bristled inwardly at the woman's insinuation that Lumen was simply a piece on a chessboard. An exhalation of breath, and then his mother's footsteps receded. Lumen sensed that the older woman had seen all she needed to see and was not inclined to linger out of sentiment. Despite the tension, there was a pang of sympathy in Lumen's heart. This family empire Dr. Hale was part of seemed to trap everyone in its web, including him, and possibly her now as well. As the evening deepened, the lights in the recovery room dimmed automatically, though Lumen remained conscious only of the bandages and the hush of medical equipment. She drifted back to sleep. Time became elastic, marked only by the occasional nudge of a nurse adjusting her position or checking vital signs. At some point in the night, she stirred to find Dr. Hale at her bedside again. She could hear him tapping softly on a tablet, likely reviewing her charts. She cleared her throat. "Hey," she managed, the single word feeling both casual and monumental, considering the swirl of emotions beneath it. "Hey yourself," he replied, setting the tablet aside. There was an almost shy quality to his tone, which caught her off guard. "You've been doing well. Minimal swelling, no early signs of rejection. Better than we hoped at this stage." Despite the dull ache behind her eyes, relief warmed her chest. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "Even if I only get partial sight, it's something I never thought would happen." His hand brushed hers. "Don't start thanking me yet. We still have a lot of ground to cover. But we're on the right track, I promise." He hesitated, then added, "And as soon as you're stable, we'll address the, other matter." There it was. The marriage. In the face of her potential restoration of sight, she had almost forgotten the legal contract that hovered over them. She didn't reply for a long moment, struggling to reconcile her gratitude with the uneasy knowledge that she owed him more than a debt of thanks. She owed him her hand in marriage, which might either unite them in a genuine partnership or trap them in a hollow arrangement neither truly desired. Dr. Hale seemed to sense her turmoil. "I know it's complicated," he murmured. "But let's get you through recovery. One step at a time." She nodded, turning her head toward the sound of his voice, even though she could see nothing but darkness through the gauze. "One step at a time," she repeated, using the refrain to calm herself. She thought of Harriet, who had pressed her to keep her guard up. She thought of her parents, who had gone to every extreme to find a miracle for her eyes. She even thought of Dr. Hale's mother and the icy undercurrent that accompanied her presence. Lumen had to gather her strength, for her own sake, if for no one else's. In the days that followed, nurses checked her bandages for drainage and infection. She learned to navigate the immediate post-op environment by counting steps from her bed to the bathroom, an old habit she thought she might never need again. Part of her longed to snatch the bandages off, desperate to catch a glimpse of the world, but each time she considered it, she remembered Dr. Hale's gentle admonition, patience. Even a minor rush could damage the fragile implants or increase the likelihood of rejection. Finally, near the end of the first week, Drive West came in with fresh bandages and the necessary instruments to begin a preliminary check of Lumen's eyes. Dr. Hale stood at the foot of the bed, quiet but attentive, as Drive West carefully unraveled the top layer of gauze. Lumen's heartbeat thundered. She swallowed hard, trying to manage her expectations. Spots of light flickered at the edge of her awareness as the last strip of material came free, replaced by a protective patch that still blocked external vision. She felt the cool air brush against her eyelids for the first time in days. "Don't open your eyes yet," Drive West warned in a soothing voice. "I need to apply these drops to keep everything lubricated." Lumen nodded, her chest tight with anticipation. A moment later came a slight sting as medicated fluid trickled across her eyelids. "One layer off," Dr. Hale said, his voice soft yet laden with hope. "One more to go in a couple of days. Then we'll see what you can see." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. She managed a shaky smile, although her heart pounded so loudly it echoed in her ears. She sensed that behind his calm professionalism, he too felt the tension of this moment. Whether all his research had led them to a genuine breakthrough or a disappointing failure would soon become evident. That evening, they let her rest. She was exhausted but too anxious to sleep deeply. At some point after dark, she heard Dr. Hale come in. He sat in the chair by her bed, quietly going through what sounded like more notes. She was touched by his constant presence, reminded again that their connection went beyond the clinical. She still wasn't sure what that meant, whether genuine feelings were forming or whether they were both just bound by a desperate circumstance. Yet she found herself comforted by the sound of his breath as he sat nearby. When he finally rose to leave, she asked, barely above a whisper, "Why are you doing all this for me?" He paused, lingering in the doorway. "Because I believe in this procedure," he replied at first, his voice low. "And, because you believed in it too. Believed in me." In the hush that followed, she heard the faint click of the door closing behind him. She lay back, mind racing over every doubt, every glimmer of hope. Soon, she would open her eyes. If luck was on their side, she'd see something other than the black void she had known for so long. But would that revelation solve everything, or would it only open the door to new conflicts and choices? Alone in the dim hospital room, she clung to that question as she drifted into restless sleep, waiting for the day she would discover the color and shape of the world she'd never truly known. 2 more days slipped by in a haze of cautious hope and unspoken fears. In that time, the medical team kept a watchful eye on Lumen's condition, monitoring the delicate balance between her body's natural healing process and the new implants that now resided in her eyes. Though she still wore protective coverings most of the time, fleeting moments of partial exposure had allowed dim light to leak through, kindling in her mind the tantalizing possibility that her world might soon transform from perpetual darkness into breathtaking color. On the morning when Drive West declared that the final bandages could be safely removed, Lumen lay propped up against a bank of pillows in her hospital bed, nerves crackling through her entire body. She hadn't slept well the previous night. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined opening them to a riot of colors or, conversely, the same old black void. Even the staff seemed to sense her anxiety, nurses offered extra reassurances, and Dr. Hale stayed close, though he refrained from hovering too much, giving her space to process each step on her own. When Drive West arrived with a tray of sterile instruments and a series of eye drops, Lumen's heart pounded so loudly it nearly drowned out the soft hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Dr. Hale stood at the foot of the bed, arms folded over his chest in what looked, to Lumen's still bandaged eyes, like an attempt to maintain a clinical detachment. She could almost feel his tension, despite his outward calm. Drive West spoke in her warm, no-nonsense tone, "All right, Lumen. I'll remove the second layer of bandages and the protective patch. After that, we'll dim the lights. Your eyes will be incredibly sensitive at first, so don't force them open too wide. We'll apply some medicated drops to reduce inflammation, and I'll guide you through every step. Is that clear?" Lumen exhaled unsteadily. "Yes. I'm ready." She wasn't entirely sure if she believed her own words, but there was no turning back now. She felt Drive West's practiced hands gently begin to unravel the gauze. With each layer peeled away, the air felt cooler against her skin. Her eyelashes fluttered involuntarily as they were freed from the soft, clingy fabric. When at last the final patch was lifted, the glare of light, even in that moment before Drive West had a chance to dim the room, seared through Lumen's closed eyelids. She winced, her breath catching in her throat. Though she had yet to open her eyes, it already felt different. There was a brightness penetrating her awareness, something altogether foreign after so many years of total darkness. "Take it slow," Drive West reminded her. She reached up and switched off the brightest overhead lamps. The room's illumination fell to a gentle, ambient glow. "All right, Lumen. Whenever you feel ready, try opening your eyes just a bit. Don't panic if it's blurry or if you see strange halos. That's normal." Lumen's fingers gripped the edge of the hospital blanket, knuckles going white. She drew in a shaky breath and let her eyelids flutter open. At first, everything was a blur of pale light. Her mind had no reference point for color, shape, or depth in this new reality. It took her several seconds to realize that yes, there was something in front of her. Gradually, gradients of shadow and luminescence began to coalesce. Her heartbeat roared in her ears. This wasn't the empty blackness of before, nor was it crisp vision like the doctors might have. She could see vague forms, soft, shifting outlines. The bed beneath her, the edges of a chair by the wall, and then the silhouette of Drive West in front of her. It was as though she were peering through frosted glass. "DDR, Hale," she managed to whisper, turning her head toward the second figure standing at the foot of the bed. Her eyes struggled to focus on him, but she could perceive his shape, taller and broader in the shoulders than Drive West, and possibly with darker hair, though color remained an elusive, muddled concept. She heard him inhale a quiet, tremulous breath. "I'm here," he said, voice hushed. "Try not to strain. Your visual cortex needs time to adjust." Lumen nodded, blinking rapidly. Tears sprang up, partly from the strain on her new eyes, partly from raw emotion. "I see something," she murmured, her lips twisting into a shaky smile. A wave of relief and astonishment crashed over her. Even in this blurry form, the world had shape, and that alone was a miracle beyond her wildest hopes. Drive West gently applied medicated drops. The chill of the fluid made Lumen's eyelids flutter, intensifying the indistinct light around her. "This will help with any inflammation," Drive West said, her voice kind. "You're doing incredibly well. Don't be discouraged by the lack of clarity. The next few days are critical for neural adaptation." Slowly, as her eyes grew less overwhelmed, Lumen took stock of her surroundings. She could make out the lighter square of a window on one wall, though she couldn't see details of what lay beyond it. A machine beeped softly to her left, its shape bulky and unfamiliar. And then her gaze returned to Dr. Hale, drawn by the magnetism of gratitude and curiosity. His form stood out from the background, a tall figure with softly blurred edges. She wished she could see his face, to read his expression. "Thank you," she breathed, tears threatening to spill anew. "All of you. I can't believe I'm actually seeing something, even if it's just fuzzy shadows." Dr. Hale's voice was thick with emotion. "You've worked hard for this, Lumen. It's not just our doing." She detected the faint quiver in his tone, the concealed relief that matched her own unsteady joy. For the rest of that day, she practiced using her new vision little by little, guided by Drive West's caution to avoid overstimulation. Whenever Lumen's eyes grew too tired, they covered them with a gentle eye shield to let her rest. It was a strange push and pull, excitement fueled her need to keep looking at everything, but her fragile optic nerves and untrained brain tired easily, demanding frequent breaks. Harriet arrived in the late afternoon, her voice calling softly from the hallway, "Lumen. Is it okay if I come in?" Lumen smiled instinctively. She had told Harriet about the bandage removal, and her friend had come as soon as she could. Dr. Hale, noticing the visitors, stepped aside to give them space, while Drive West slipped out to update the other staff on Lumen's progress. Lumen turned her head, spotting Harriet's silhouette. She couldn't see Harriet's exact features, but the outline of her friend's short haircut and the tilt of her head were recognizably different from Drive West or Dr. Hale. "Oh my God," Harriet exclaimed softly, crossing the room to stand near the bed. "You're looking at me, aren't you?" Tears threatened again, but Lumen blinked them back to avoid discomfort. "I'm seeing something," she said with a breathy laugh. "It's not clear, but I can tell you're there. You have a shape." She let out a slightly hysterical giggle at how bizarre that sounded. Harriet sniffled, reaching for Lumen's hand. "If you could only see my face right now, I'm a mess," she joked, her voice trembling with joy. "I'm so proud of you. This is incredible." They talked for a while, about Harriet's day, about the flood of congratulations from a few old neighbors who had heard the news, about the next stages of physical and visual therapy. Harriet also, with a gentle but firm approach, asked about the looming marriage. Lumen felt an odd mixture of warmth and apprehension coil in her stomach, remembering the promise she had made. In the glow of her newly regained sense of sight, that vow took on a heavier weight. "He's kept his part of the bargain," Harriet said quietly, glancing at Dr. Hale, who lingered in the corner of the room, respectful of their conversation. "Are you sure you're ready to keep yours?" Lumen turned her attention toward the blurred figure of Dr. Hale. She could make out the way he shifted his stance, the subtle movement of his arms at his sides. "We haven't really talked about the specifics yet," she admitted. "Everything's been so focused on the surgery." "But, yes." I agreed, and I still believe I should honor that. The truth was, she no longer felt like that arrangement was simply a cold transaction. Through late-night checkups, quiet reassurances, and his unflagging presence during her most vulnerable hours, she sensed genuine compassion from him. It gave her reason to hope that their union might not be as hollow as she had once feared. Later that evening, after Harriet departed, Lumen sat on the edge of the bed, gently massaging her temples while Dr. Hale perched on a stool across from her. The hospital staff had again dimmed the lights, giving her newly sensitized eyes a chance to rest. "You seem more at ease," he observed, voice soft. "Are you still in pain?" She shook her head. "A little discomfort, but mostly I'm just overwhelmed." She paused, letting out a self-conscious laugh. "I can't even imagine how different it'll be once my vision gets clearer. I'm trying not to get my hopes too high. Drive West said it could take weeks or months to reach my maximum potential. And there's always the risk of complications." He placed his hands on his knees, leaning forward. "You've come through the hardest part. We'll keep monitoring you for signs of rejection or infection, but so far, everything is stable. If you keep responding this well, you'll graduate to stronger visual therapy soon." His reassurance made her smile, though her mind returned to the other promise between them. She took a careful breath. "Dr. Hale." "Preston," she began, trying out his first name, something she rarely did. "We have to talk about what happens now. You went to all this trouble to make me see again, and I said I'd marry you in return. But I want to know, do you still want that? Or have things changed?" Her voice was tentative. She wasn't sure which answer she feared more. He exhaled slowly, as though collecting his thoughts. "My family certainly expects it," he said at length. "But I'm asking for your perspective, not theirs. From what I've seen, we've come to trust each other, at least medically. And I don't regret giving you this chance. I never will." He paused, letting the weight of the next word settle. "But if you want out of the agreement?" Lumen's hand shot up. "No. I'm not backing out." Her breath caught in her throat. "I made that choice knowingly. You said from the start, if the procedure was successful, I'd become your wife. You kept your promise. I intend to keep mine." He fell silent for a moment. Then he rose from the stool, taking a step closer. She could see him more clearly than before, a tall presence, the edges of his frame no longer melting quite so thoroughly into the background. The shape of his shoulders was broad, his posture composed. The lines of his face remained a blur, but she could sense his earnestness. "If it's what you want," he replied softly, "then we should do it soon. My mother's already maneuvering behind the scenes, setting up expectations for a formal announcement." A hint of exasperation crept into his tone, betraying the pressure he faced. "But I'd rather we choose how it happens." Her lips curled in a small, wry smile. "Perhaps something quiet, without the pomp and circumstance." She recalled the opulence of the mansion, how overwhelmed she had felt even in total darkness. Now that she had a hint of sight, she worried a grand affair would be too much to bear. He nodded. "We can arrange something small. A civil ceremony, at least for the legal aspect. Later, if you decide you want something more elaborate, we can discuss it." With a subtle shift, he drew nearer, his voice growing intimate in the hushed hospital room. "I know this wasn't your dream scenario," he added gently. "But I promise, I'll do my best to make sure you feel safe." She realized her heart was pounding again, though not solely out of fear or medical anxiety. It was the thrill and terror of stepping into a life she had never imagined, one filled with new sensations, new responsibilities, and perhaps even new emotions that she had yet to name. There was a chance, however slim, that this strange union might grow into a genuine bond. Or it could turn into a gilded cage. Neither Lumen nor Dr. Hale pretended otherwise. Reaching out, she touched his sleeve, letting the soft fabric reassure her that this was real. "Thank you," she whispered. "For all of this. Not just the surgery, but for," she gestured vaguely, indicating the intangible support he had offered throughout her ordeal. "For being there." He lifted his hand, hovering briefly before gently resting it over hers. "We're in this together now," he murmured, voice tinged with a quiet intensity. "One step at a time, right?" She nodded, unable to suppress a slight tremor of relief. One step at a time. In that fleeting moment, the reality of her changed world enveloped her. She could see the faint outline of his figure, hear the compassion woven into his words, and feel the resonant calm of his presence. Despite the looming pressures, a formidable mother-in-law, corporate meddling, and the complexities of forging a life with a near stranger, she sensed a cautious spark of optimism. She had embarked on this path to gain her sight, but perhaps she had also found an ally, or even something more, in Dr. Preston Hale. For now, Lumen allowed herself a moment of gratitude for the small miracles already granted, the emergence of a hazy, uncertain vision and the quiet promise in the man standing before her. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more steps in her healing, and likely a quick march toward a wedding ceremony that was both surreal and oddly hopeful. As she sank back against the pillows, she closed her aching eyes, letting the day's exhaustion wash over her. In the darkness behind her eyelids, new colors danced, dreamlike and tentative, her mind already beginning to learn the language of sight that on the morning of the wedding, Lumen woke to the muted glow of early sunlight. Weeks had passed since her bandages first came off, and her vision, while still not perfect, had sharpened enough that she could discern the outlines and colors of most things around her. She had spent those weeks in physical and visual therapy, learning to navigate a world lit by hues she'd never experienced before. Now, as she blinked the lingering sleep from her eyes, she couldn't help marveling at the gentle wash of dawn filtering through the hotel curtains. Soft oranges and pale pinks, colors she'd previously known only as words, stretched across the sky in a quiet promise of the day ahead. Yet her heart hammered with a mix of nerves and anticipation. She was getting married to Dr. Preston Hale, a man she'd first known as her mysterious benefactor and brilliant surgeon, then as her quiet companion through countless nights of post-op care. The entire arrangement had begun as a deal: he would restore her sight, and she would agree to be his wife. Over time, that stark transaction had evolved into something more subtle, tinged with genuine affection and the fragile hope that they could forge an honest life together. Still, she couldn't entirely dispel the flutter of anxiety in her chest, or the half-formed question pressing at the edges of her mind: what if, after all of this, their connection was just an illusion created by circumstance? Across the hotel suite, Harriet rummaged through a garment bag, carefully lifting the dress they'd chosen. It was a simple ivory slip with a modest neckline, far from the ornate gowns Lumen had once imagined in her childhood fairy tales, but it felt true to who she was now. Through her still recovering eyes, she could make out the delicate lace at the collar and hem, and she ran her fingertips over the soft fabric with a sense of wonder. A year ago, she would have relied solely on touch to explore its texture. Today, she could also marvel at its faint sheen. "You all right?" Harriet asked gently, noticing her friend's distraction. "Big day. Big changes." Lumen nodded, exhaling a shaky breath. "I'm okay. Just, a lot to take in. Feels like everything's been leading up to this moment, my parents' hopes for my vision, Dr. Hale's entire research journey. Part of me still can't believe I can see." Harriet pressed a comforting hand to Lumen's shoulder. "And now you're stepping into a new phase. Listen, I know this started as a complicated arrangement, but Preston's been good to you. He's at least shown he cares on a personal level, right? A faint smile curved Lumen's lips. He has. He's been there every time I needed reassurance, even if it was just a silent presence. We've talked more these past weeks, about his research, about his family's business expectations, about my own fears. She paused, tracing a seam in the dress with trembling fingers. It doesn't feel like a simple deal anymore. She dared a glance in the mirror. Her reflection was still an adjustment, her face was sharper to her than it had been a few days ago. She noticed the gentle slope of her cheeks, the length of her eyelashes, the curve of her dark hair. In some lights, her skin tone bore a faint golden tint. She found it both exhilarating and overwhelming to observe these details without needing a guide. When Harriet guided the dress over her head, she shivered at the cool whisper of fabric against her skin, half from nerves and half from gratitude. "Let's see how you look," Harriet said, stepping back. Lumen turned slowly toward the full-length mirror propped against the wall. She saw an image that was just clear enough to recognize as herself, clad in a soft ivory that complemented her form. Tears pricked her eyes, partially from the emotional weight of the moment and partly from the strain of focusing so intently. The slightest shift could still trigger dizziness, but she steeled herself, breathing through the rush of sensation. "It's lovely," she whispered. Harriet beamed, dabbing at her own eyes. A soft knock on the door interrupted them. Lumen called, "Come in," expecting the hotel staff, maybe the makeup artist Harriet had hired for some final touch-ups. Instead, Drive West stepped in, wearing an elegant but understated dress of pale lilac. Her usually crisp, professional demeanor softened around the edges. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said gently. "I just wanted to check on our bride. I know you've been pushing your vision a lot this week, and I wanted to ensure you're not overtaxing yourself." Lumen managed a grateful smile. "Thank you, Drive West. I'm doing all right. Just a bit of wedding jitters." Harriet snorted a laugh. Understatement of the year. She turned to Drive West. "Would you mind checking her eyes once more, just in case? Better safe than sorry." Drive West nodded and approached, holding out a small penlight. She examined Lumen's pupils with quick, practiced motions. "Any headaches or flashes of pain?" she asked quietly. "No, just a bit of strain if I stare too long," Lumen replied. "I've been diligent with the eye drops, I promise." Drive West chuckled, capping the penlight. "I know you have. Everything seems fine. Just remember, if you feel any sudden discomfort, step away to a quiet spot, dim the lights, and rest. The ceremony is important, but your long-term recovery is more so. Dr. Hale wouldn't want you jeopardizing your vision for a single day's event." Lumen nodded, a slow warmth blooming in her chest at the mention of Dr. Hale's concern. Even in the swirl of wedding preparations, she couldn't forget the underlying purpose of all this. He had given her the gift of sight, and she'd vowed to stand at his side as his wife. If she was honest, she wanted to stand there not just out of obligation, but out of genuine, budding affection. Once Drive West left, Harriet helped finish the last touches, smoothing Lumen's hair and securing a simple pearl clip behind her ear. Then, with a final approving nod, Harriet guided her downstairs, taking the elevator to the small hotel courtyard Dr. Hale had reserved for the ceremony. They had chosen a private area with a modest archway draped in flowing white cloth and a few rows of chairs reserved for close friends and Dr. Hale's immediate family. Even with her limited vision, Lumen could see shapes moving about, the shimmer of sunlight on polished chairs, bursts of color from fresh flowers arranged near the arch, and a discreet gathering of perhaps 30 people. One figure in particular stood by the archway, tall and composed. The sight of him sent her heart thrumming. She forced herself to inhale slowly, stepping forward, Harriet's supportive arm looped through hers. As she drew nearer, the lines of Dr. Hale's face resolved a bit more. His hair appeared dark, chestnut, perhaps, and he wore a crisp suit. She could finally catch glimpses of the structure of his features, a strong jaw, an elegant nose. Though a slight blur still blurred the finer details, she could sense that he was smiling. Standing beside him, somewhat stiffly, was his mother. Lumen's own anxiety redoubled. She remembered the woman's aloof tone, her scathing remarks. Even now, Dr. Hale's mother wore an expression that Lumen might interpret as reluctant acceptance. Her posture was regal, chin tilted. But Lumen noted the slightest nod of acknowledgement as she neared, an acknowledgement that she was here, about to become part of the family whether they liked it or not. Harriet gently squeezed Lumen's hand before stepping aside so that Dr. Hale could meet her halfway. He reached for Lumen's hands, and she placed hers in his. The warmth of his grip steadied her racing heart. "You look beautiful," he said softly, uncertain if it was the right word. "It's more than I imagined." She managed a quick, nervous laugh. "I can't see everything perfectly, but I can tell you're dashing." "I think," she teased, voice shaking just enough to betray her butterflies. A hush fell over the small gathering. Someone signaled that the officiant was ready, a gentle-faced older man wearing dark robes. Lumen realized she was trembling slightly. This was it, this solemn promise, begun as a transaction, now taking on the weight of a genuine commitment. She felt Harriet's encouraging presence behind her, along with Drive West and a few other colleagues who had become friends during her recovery. On Dr. Hale's side stood a handful of distinguished relatives and a few of his medical team. And, of course, his mother, watching with reserved composure. The officiant began to speak, his words echoing in Lumen's ears, a reminder of the significance of marriage, the unity it symbolizes, the trust it requires. As he spoke, she ventured a look at Dr. Hale, fighting the urge to squint to see him clearly. She caught the outline of his lips, curving in a gentle smile, and the faint glint of what might be moisture in his eyes. A surge of tenderness rushed through her, followed by a certainty that even if their future was uncharted, they stood on an honest foundation, two people who had saved each other in different ways. She repeated the vows, voice trembling, promising to be there for him in sickness and in health, for better or for worse. Her heart tugged at the significance. He had already seen her at her most vulnerable, eyes bandaged, body weak from surgery, and never wavered. She vowed silently to do the same for him if life tested them. He echoed her words with quiet conviction, his tone resonant and sincere. Then he slipped a ring onto her finger, a simple band with a tiny stone. Lumen blinked back tears, wishing she could see it in all its clarity, but cherishing the moment nonetheless. When it was her turn, she fumbled for his hand. Harriet discreetly guided her, so that Lumen could place a matching ring on his finger. Finally, the officiant gave a warm, congratulatory statement, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may share your first kiss as newlyweds." A soft, nervous giggle escaped her as Dr. Hale bent forward. She tilted her face up, eyes half closed against the brilliant sunlight, meeting him in a gentle, hesitant kiss. Applause rippled among the guests, followed by a surge of relief and an almost electric excitement that pulsed through her chest. The sensation of his lips, warm and tender, was her first real, public confirmation of what had grown between them, a bond forged from hope and healing. After the ceremony, Harriet ushered them aside for a few photographs, but Lumen felt her energy dipping quickly. Bright lights and constant visual input taxed her newly awakened eyes. She excused herself for a moment, stepping into a quieter corner of the courtyard where the sunlight wasn't so strong. Dr. Hale joined her shortly, concern etched into his features, what she could discern of them, at least. "Are you all right?" he asked, placing a hand on her shoulder. She nodded. "Just a little overwhelmed. It's still a lot for my eyes to handle." She offered a rueful smile. "Seems I can't quite enjoy the entire day without a reminder of my limits." He shook his head gently. "Don't apologize. We'll take this at your pace. None of this is worth risking your health." They shared a soft moment of mutual understanding, the hubbub of guests mingling in the background. Beyond them, Harriet was chatting animatedly with Drive West about how remarkable it all was. Dr. Hale's mother stood a short distance away, accepting polite congratulations, though she frequently glanced in their direction. Something in her posture had changed since the ceremony, a slight relaxing of tension. She even gave Lumen a fleeting half-smile when their eyes happened to meet. It wasn't a full embrace of acceptance, but it was not outright disdain either. Perhaps that was as close to goodwill as they would receive from her for now. Eventually, they gathered for a small luncheon in the hotel's private banquet room. Lumen took the seat of honor beside Dr. Hale, scanning the table through her not-quite-clear vision, Harriet's bright blouse, Drive West's lilac dress, and the shapes of various plates and cutlery. She let out an inward sigh of gratitude that she could at least glimpse these everyday details. Her gaze moved to Dr. Hale. Though she still couldn't perfectly read the subtleties of his face, she caught the sincerity in his eyes whenever he glanced her way, a warmth that lit a spark of reassurance in her. They made small talk, accepted toasts and well wishes, and shared a slice of cake that Lumen found delightfully sweet. Amid the swirl of conversation, Harriet clinked her glass, clearing her throat to address the newlyweds. "I just want to say," she began, voice thick with emotion, "that what we witness today is more than a marriage. It's proof that hope, science, and genuine care can join forces to change lives. Lumen, you've come such a long way, and Preston," she turned to him, raising an eyebrow, "thank you for helping her see, literally, that there's more to life than darkness." He inclined his head, a hint of humility in his expression. "It was my privilege," he said. His eyes flicked to Lumen, and though she couldn't make out every detail, she recognized the softness there. By the time evening descended, most guests had departed, leaving behind a scattering of half-empty champagne glasses and leftover slices of cake. Dr. Hale and Lumen retreated to a nearby suite that had been readied for their wedding night. Her nerves sparked anew at the thought of sharing this intimate space with him. Despite all that had transpired, the surgeries, the late-night hospital conversations, the vows at the altar, this felt like stepping into another new world, one with emotions she had yet to explore. They entered the suite, flipping on a modest lamp. A plush armchair sat near the window, the curtains drawn. Lumen let out a slow breath, eyes flicking around the softly lit room. It was too dim to cause her strain, and she appreciated the golden glow against the walls. She turned to Dr. Hale, heart hammering. "So, we're really married," she murmured, a mixture of awe and trepidation in her tone. He gave a gentle nod, clasping her hands in his. "Yes, we are." After a small pause, he added, "I realize this began as an arrangement to satisfy my family's demands, but I meant what I said earlier, I don't regret it. You were never just a patient to me, Lumen. I'm not sure what will become or how our marriage will evolve, but I want to keep discovering it with you." She felt tears prick her eyes, and this time, she wasn't bothered by the minor sting. "I want that too," she whispered. Carefully, she lifted a hand to his face, trying to make out the contours she had begun to see more clearly these past few weeks, his cheekbones, the faint lines around his eyes, even the edge of a smile. "It might take me time to see you fully, but I feel like I already do in some ways." He leaned into her touch, letting out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of all their uncertainty and cautious hope. They stood there, heads bowed close, the soft hush of the suite embracing them. It was a quiet, unassuming moment, yet for Lumen, it held the promise of a life illuminated by more than just the surgery's success. Here, at the threshold of a marriage she hadn't planned, she realized that hope was no longer just about the ability to see the sun or the moon, it was also about forging a shared future where trust and tenderness could grow. Later that night, when she curled up beside him, the lamp extinguished, she closed her eyes to the darkness. Not the old, crushing void that had defined her world, but a gentle darkness that carried echoes of shapes and colors she had beheld that day. There would be obstacles ahead, his mother's expectations, the ever-watchful media once they learned of the family's new miracle bride, and the continuing adjustments of her healing vision. Yet, nestled against his warmth, she felt a quiet certainty that whatever trials arose, they wouldn't face them alone. They had chosen each other, for better or for worse, in an arrangement that had blossomed into something undeniably real. In the morning, they would wake as husband and wife, stepping forward, one careful, hopeful step at a time. And in Lumen's chest, a gentle thrill pulsed, whispering that maybe, just maybe, the greatest miracle wasn't simply the return of her sight, but the unexpected love she had found in the man who had made it possible.